The early morning light spilled softly through the windows of the Whitmore household, bathing the kitchen in a golden glow. Outside, the gentle hum of a distant school bus echoed through the sleepy suburban neighborhood. A signal that a new day had begun. 12-year-old Madison Whitmore's Northridge Academy. AP. Eat something, Maddie. Her mother, Caroline Whitmore, said. Maddie's grip on her spoon tightened as she finally muttered, quote. Caroline set her cup down and took a seat across from her daughter. You'll be fine today, Maddie. I know how scary it feels to start over. But you'll find your rhythm. Give it time. Maddie shrugged, her gaze fixed on the bowl in front of her. It's not just that, she admitted in a low voice. What if they find out about you? About us? Caroline tilted her head slightly. And what if they do? She asked softly. You're not defined by what I do or what people think of our family. You're Madison. Just be yourself. That's enough. Maddie gave a half-hearted nod. Though the knot of anxiety in her stomach didn't loosen, she wished she could share her mother's confidence. But starting at a new school, one where everyone seemed to come from important families, felt like stepping into a battlefield. The family car pulled up to the gates of Northridge Academy later that morning. The school was a sprawling red brick building with arched windows, towering ivy-covered walls, and an air of polished sophistication. It looked like something out of a storybook, except for the throngs of students who crowded the entrance, chatting in clusters and laughing as they made their way inside. Maddie clutched her backpack straps tightly as her mother's car slowed to a stop. You've got this, Caroline said softly, her hand resting on Maddie's shoulder. One step at a time. Okay? Okay, Maddie whispered, though her heart thumped so loudly she could barely hear her own voice. As she stepped out of the car, the breeze brushed against her cheeks, carrying with it the faint sound of the school bell ringing. A few students glanced her way as she walked through the gates, their curious stares lingering just long enough to make her cheeks burn. Inside the building, the hallways buzzed with noise, lockers slamming, voices echoing off the walls, and the occasional sound of laughter bouncing between the marble floors and ornate ceilings. Maddie moved quickly through the crowd, clutching the printed schedule she'd received in the mail. Room 2A, she murmured under her breath. Homeroom. She found the door halfway down a long corridor and took a deep breath before stepping inside. The classroom was already half full, the chatter growing louder as students settled into their seats. Maddie scanned the room nervously before slipping into a desk near the middle, far enough to avoid the teacher's gaze but not so far back that she looked like she didn't care. Moments later, the door opened again, and the room immediately fell silent. Maddie looked up just in time to see Mrs. Trenton step into the room. She was tall, with sharp features and steel gray hair twisted into an impossibly neat bun. Her dark, tailored blazer gave her an air of authority, and when she spoke, her voice carried through the room like the toll of a distant bell. Good morning, Mrs. Trenton said, setting a leather-bound planner onto her desk with a decisive thud. I am Mrs. Trenton, your literature teacher, and I will expect nothing but your best this year. Excellence is earned, not given, and mediocrity will not be tolerated. The room was so quiet Maddie swore she could hear the ticking of the wall clock. Mrs. Trenton's sharp gaze swept across the class, lingering briefly on each student as though measuring their worth in mere seconds. When her eyes landed on Maddie, they seemed to pause, narrowing ever so slightly before moving on. A chill ran through Maddie's spine. She couldn't explain it, but there was something unsettling about the way Mrs. Trenton looked at her. It was as though the teacher had already decided who Maddie was, and dismissed her entirely. The first day passed in a blur of introductions, syllabuses, and awkward silences. Maddie did her best to keep her head down, answering questions only when necessary and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might recognize her last name. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Trenton's gaze was on her every time she spoke or moved. As the final bell rang and Maddie gathered her books, she heard a voice behind her. Hey, you're the new girl, right? Madison something? Maddie turned to see a boy with sandy hair and an overconfident smirk leaning casually against a desk. It's Whitmore, she corrected quietly, tightening her grip on her backpack. Whitmore, he repeated, drawing out the word. Figures. You're that author's kid, aren't you? Clarissa Whitmore's daughter? Maddie's heart sank. Yeah, she muttered, trying to brush past him. The boy chuckled. loud enough for a few nearby students to hear. Guess that means you're one of the special ones, huh? Bet you don't even have to try. Leave me alone, Maddie mumbled, her face burning as she hurried toward the door. Behind her, she could hear the boys' laughter echoing through the now empty classroom. At home that evening, Maddie sat curled up in the corner of the living room, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees. Her mother glanced up from her writing desk, sensing something was wrong. Maddie, how was your first day? Caroline asked softly. It was fine, Maddie lied, staring at the floor. Caroline set down her pen and crossed the room to sit beside her daughter. Talk to me, sweetheart. Maddie hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. They know who I am. Mom, some boy said I didn't have to try because of you. Caroline's expression softened, and she gently brushed a strand of hair from Maddie's face. What did I tell you? Maddie? Other people's opinions don't define you. Your work, your kindness, and your perseverance, that's what matters. Maddie nodded faintly, but inside, the knot in her stomach remained. Tomorrow would be another day, and she wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The next morning, Madison woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest. She had barely slept the night before, replaying every moment of the previous day over and over in her mind. The boys' laughter, Mrs. Trenton's cold stare, and the whispers of her classmates seemed to echo endlessly in her thoughts. Maybe I'm getting sick, she muttered as she sat up, hoping her mother might let her stay home. But when Caroline knocked on her door a few minutes later, she knew there was no escaping it. Time to get up, Maddie, her mother called cheerfully. You're going to have a better day today, I can feel it. Madison sighed, dragging herself out of bed. She couldn't share her mother's optimism, but she didn't want to disappoint her either. After all, her mom always said that showing up was half the battle. The hallways of Northridge Academy were just as noisy and intimidating as they'd been the day before. Students stood in clusters, chatting and laughing, while Madison quietly slipped through the crowd. She kept her head down, clutching her books close to her chest as she made her way to room 2A for literature. Mrs. Trenton was already there when Madison arrived. The teacher stood at the front of the room, scribbling an agenda on the whiteboard in precise, slanted handwriting. Madison slid into her seat near the middle of the classroom and immediately busied herself by organizing her books. As the bell rang, Mrs. Trenton turned to face the class. Today, we'll begin our first major assignment, an identity essay, she announced, her voice as sharp as ever. You are to write about a moment that shaped who you are. I expect introspection, depth, and a clear understanding of yourself. Madison's stomach dropped. She loved writing, but something about Mrs. Trenton made her doubt herself. Would anything she wrote ever be good enough for this woman? Any questions? Mrs. Trenton asked. Silence. Good. The essays are due Friday. Start brainstorming. At lunch, Madison sat at a small table by herself, picking at a sandwich she didn't have much of an appetite for. She scanned the cafeteria, spotting the boy from yesterday, Jason. She thought his name was, surrounded by his group of friends. They were loud and obnoxious. The kind of kids who took up space without caring who they inconvenienced. Jason noticed her glance and smirked, nudging his friend and whispering something that made them both laugh. Madison quickly looked away. Mind if I sit here? The voice was soft, almost hesitant. Madison looked up to see Sophie, a girl with curly brown hair and kind eyes, holding a lunch tray. Sure, Madison said, surprised. Sophie sat down across from her, setting her tray on the table. I noticed you've been sitting alone, she said with a smile. I thought you might want some company. Madison's shoulders relaxed slightly. Thanks, she said quietly. I'm Madison. I know, Sophie replied, grinning. I heard a few people talking yesterday. You're, her daughter, right? Madison tensed, but Sophie quickly added, don't worry, I don't care about that. I just thought you seemed nice. Everyone else is too busy trying to be cool. Relief flooded through Madison. Yeah, it's not really a big deal to me either. Sophie took a bite of her apple and shrugged. It's only a big deal if you let it be. People love to talk, but they don't know anything about you. Madison smiled faintly. Thanks, she said again, and for the first time since starting at Northridge, she didn't feel completely invisible. The rest of the week passed in a blur of classes and homework. But Mrs. Trenton's identity essay weighed on Madison's mind. Each night, she sat at her desk, staring at the blank page in front of her. What moment could she write about? Did she even have a moment that had shaped her? Every attempt felt forced and hollow. On Thursday evening, as Madison sat in her room trying once again to find the right words, her mother knocked softly and peeked inside. "How's the essay coming?" Caroline asked, stepping in and sitting on the edge of the bed. Madison sighed, slumping back in her chair. "It's not. I don't know what to write." Caroline tilted her head thoughtfully. "Why don't you start with what you're feeling? Sometimes, the best stories come from the truth, even if it's messy." Madison looked at her mom, frowning. "What truth?" "Well," Caroline said softly, "you're at a new school, surrounded by people who don't know you. Maybe that's the moment. How it feels to start over and find yourself." Madison's brows furrowed as she thought about it. But what if Mrs. Trenton thinks it's not good enough? Then that's her problem, Caroline said firmly. "The important thing is that you tell your story. No one else's opinion matters." Madison bit her lip, considering her mom's words. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll try." That night, Madison sat at her desk, pen in hand. She thought about how it felt to be the new girl, about Jason's taunts, Mrs. Trenton's cold stare, and the way people whispered her name like it was something to gossip about. Then she thought about Sophie, and her mom's advice. "You're Madison. Just be yourself." Slowly, she began to write. The first day at a new school feels like stepping into a room where everyone already knows the story. Except you. They've written you in as a character you don't recognize. And no one asks if you want to play the part. You're just there, waiting to be seen for who you really are. The words came easier now, flowing from her heart as she described the pressure to fit in, the fear of not being good enough, and the hope of finding her own voice. When she finally put her pen down, her notebook was filled with words that felt real, honest. She didn't know if Mrs. Trenton would like it, but for the first time, Madison didn't care. This was her story. The next morning, Madison walked into room 2A with her essay carefully tucked into her folder. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it, her heart pounding with nerves. She had poured herself into this piece, her feelings, her fears, her truth, and handing it over felt like exposing part of her soul. Mrs. Trenton stood at the front of the classroom, her usual stern expression giving no hint of warmth as she addressed the class. "I trust you all brought your essays," she said crisply. "Pass them forward." Madison hesitated for just a moment before pulling the essay from her folder. She glanced at the neatly written title on the first page, "Finding My Voice." The words felt powerful now, but she couldn't ignore the anxiety creeping up her spine. As she passed her paper forward, she noticed Mrs. Trenton's gaze settle on her for just a moment longer than usual. It was the same cold, calculating stare that made her stomach twist. Forcing herself to look away, she slumped in her chair and focused on the blank notebook in front of her, waiting for class to begin. At lunch, Madison sat with Sophie at their usual table. It had become their unspoken tradition over the past week. Sophie, with her easygoing attitude and quick wit, had quickly become Madison's lifeline at North Ridge Academy. "So," Sophie said, taking a bite of her sandwich, "did you finish your essay last night?" Madison nodded, fiddling with the edge of her sleeve. "Yeah, I wrote about how it feels to start over and figure out who you are." Sophie grinned. "That's deep. I'm sure it's great." Madison shrugged. "I don't know. Mrs. Trenton, she's tough." "Yeah, she's kind of infamous," Sophie said, rolling her eyes. "Last year, my brother said she made a girl cry over her poetry assignment. She doesn't like anyone who doesn't fit her idea of perfect." Madison frowned, the words settling uneasily in her mind. "Why is she like that?" Sophie shrugged. "Who knows? Some people just want to feel like they're in control." Before Madison could respond, a voice interrupted their conversation. "Well, if it isn't the author's daughter." Madison froze, her fork halfway to her mouth, as Jason approached their table with two of his friends trailing behind him. His smirk was firmly in place, his voice dripping with mockery. Sophie shot him an annoyed look. "What do you want, Jason?" Jason ignored her and turned to Madison. "Did you write your essay about being famous?" he asked, crossing his arms. "Or did mommy write it for you?" Madison's cheeks burned. "Leave me alone," she muttered, refusing to look at him. Jason chuckled, clearly enjoying himself. "What? I'm just curious. It must be nice, not having to work for anything. Everything's just handed to you." "That's not true." Madison shot back, surprising herself with the strength in her voice. You don't know anything about me. Jason's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Whatever. You'll see. Trenton doesn't care about your fancy last name. Go away, Jason, Sophie said firmly, glaring at him. No one thinks you're funny. Jason scoffed, turning to leave with his friends. Whatever. Have fun playing the victim. Madison stared at her tray, her appetite gone. Sophie placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Don't listen to him. He's just jealous. I'm so tired of it. Madison whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't ask for any of this. I know, Sophie said softly, but you can't let him win. You're stronger than that. Madison managed a weak smile, grateful for Sophie's support, but Jason's words lingered in her mind. Everything's handed to you. She knew it wasn't true, but it still stung. The next day, Mrs. Trenton returned the essays. As she handed back the papers, her expression was unreadable, her sharp heels clicking against the tile floor as she moved through the rows of desks. Madison's hands felt clammy as Mrs. Trenton approached. When the teacher set her essay down on the desk, Madison's breath caught. A large red B+ was scrawled across the top of the page. And beneath it, Mrs. Trenton had written, Your ideas are personal and honest, but your execution still lacks maturity. Push yourself further next time. Madison stared at the words, a mix of relief and disappointment washing over her. A B+ wasn't bad, she knew that, but the comment felt like a dismissal. She had poured her heart into this essay, and it still wasn't enough. Let me guess, Sophie whispered as Mrs. Trenton moved on. She wasn't impressed? Madison nodded, folding the paper in half. She said I need to push myself further. That's her way of saying she doesn't know what to do with real feelings. Sophie muttered, Don't take it personally. You did great. Madison tried to smile, but she couldn't shake the sense that she'd let herself down. That evening, Madison sat in the living room with her mom, her essay folded tightly in her lap. Caroline glanced up from her laptop and immediately noticed the look on her daughter's face. How did it go? She asked gently. Madison hesitated before holding out the paper. B+, she said quietly. She said it wasn't mature enough. Caroline read the comment, her brows furrowing slightly. She set the paper down and looked at Madison. What do you think? She asked. I don't know. Madison admitted. I thought it was good. But now I feel like it wasn't enough. Like I'm not enough. Caroline shook her head. Don't let one person's opinion make you doubt yourself. Maddie, you wrote from your heart. And that's what matters. Mrs. Trenton doesn't decide your worth, you do. Madison looked down at her hands. It's hard, though. It feels like no matter what I do, I can't change how people see me. Caroline smiled softly and placed a hand on Madison's shoulder. Sometimes the hardest thing is to keep going when it feels like no one believes in you. But the only opinion that matters is your own. Madison nodded, her mother's words sinking in. She didn't have all the answers yet. But one thing was clear, she couldn't give up. Not on herself. And not on her voice. The following week brought with it the announcement of a school-wide writing competition. The prize was a scholarship for a summer writing camp, and Mrs. Trenton encouraged all students to submit their best work. Madison hesitated when she heard the announcement. A small part of her wanted to stay far away from another chance to be judged. But deep down, she knew she couldn't hide forever. That afternoon, Sophie nudged her in the hallway. You're entering the contest, right? I don't know, Madison said. What if I'm not good enough? Sophie rolled her eyes. Maddie, your essay was amazing. Don't let Mrs. Trenton or Jason get in your head. This is your chance to prove them wrong. Madison thought about it all evening. The contest was an opportunity to share her story with the entire school, to show people who she really was. The thought terrified her, but there was a spark of courage deep inside her, flickering faintly. By the time Madison sat down at her desk that night, she had made up her mind. She picked up her pen, her heart steady, and began to write. That evening, Madison sat at her desk, her notebook open to a clean page. The faint hum of the world outside drifted through her open window, the distant chirp of crickets, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, but she barely heard it. All her focus was on the blank paper in front of her. She tapped her pen against the edge of the desk, her mind racing. Writing the contest entry meant opening herself up again. It meant risking judgment, rejection, even ridicule. The memory of Jason's smirk and Mrs. Trenton's dismissive words still lingered like shadows in her thoughts. What if it's not enough? Her mother's words echoed in her mind. The only opinion that matters is your own. Taking a deep breath, Madison steadied herself and began to write. The days leading up to the contest submission deadline flew by in a blur. Madison worked late into the night, pouring her heart into every sentence. She wanted this piece to be hers, raw, honest, and unfiltered. She wrote about feeling invisible, about the weight of people's assumptions, and about the loneliness of trying to live up to an expectation she never set for herself. She wrote about the pain of being judged for something beyond her control, about how unfair it was that people saw her name before they saw her. And then, she wrote about hope, how it was possible to push through the noise, to rise above the doubts and find a voice of your own. When she finished the last sentence, Madison sat back, her hand aching and her heart pounding. She reread the final paragraph, her eyes lingering on the words. I may not be who you think I am, and I may never be who you want me to be, but I'm learning to be okay with that because I'm learning to be me. And that's enough. The next day, Madison slipped her essay into a crisp white envelope and turned it into the main office. As she handed it to the receptionist, she felt a mixture of relief and dread. You'll do great, Sophie said later that afternoon as they walked to class together. I know it. Madison managed a small smile. Thanks. You're braver than you think. Maddie, Sophie said, just remember that. The days that followed were some of the hardest Madison had faced since starting at Northridge Academy. Word of her essay entry had spread quickly. And Jason, of course, had been the first to capitalize on the news. Guess Madison thinks she's a writer now, he sneered one morning in the hallway, his voice carrying for everyone to hear. Probably just wrote about how hard her famous life is. His friends laughed, and a few students turned to stare, their faces unreadable. Madison kept walking, her heart pounding, but she didn't let her pace falter. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her upset. You okay? Sophie asked as she caught up with her. Yeah, Madison replied quietly, though her chest ached with frustration. I just don't get why he cares so much. Sophie sighed. Some people tear others down because they're afraid to look at themselves. Madison nodded, filing those words away. Maybe Jason's taunts said more about him than they did about her. That afternoon, Madison sat in literature class, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mrs. Trenton stood at the front of the room, her sharp eyes scanning the class. The writing contest entries have been submitted, Mrs. Trenton announced, her voice as crisp as ever. Winners will be announced at the assembly next Friday. Regardless of the outcome, I hope each of you took this opportunity to challenge yourselves. Her gaze landed on Madison for just a moment, a flicker of something almost unreadable passing across her expression. Then she turned away, continuing with the lesson. Madison sat straighter in her chair. For once, Mrs. Trenton's stare didn't feel quite so intimidating. She had turned in her best work, and no one could take that away from her. The day of the assembly arrived quicker than Madison had expected. The school auditorium was buzzing with excitement as students filed into rows of worn wooden chairs. Teachers sat along the perimeter, murmuring quietly to one another. On stage, a microphone and podium stood waiting, the spotlight aimed squarely at its center. Madison sat with Sophie near the middle, her palms clammy and her heart racing. She tried to block out the whispers around her. Think she'll win? She probably bought it. Madison clenched her fists in her lap but kept her gaze forward. Sophie nudged her shoulder. Ignore them. You've got this. Mr. Whitaker, the principal, stepped up to the podium, his voice booming as he welcomed everyone. Today, we celebrate the hard work, creativity, and voices of our students. The writing contest entries this year were some of the best we've ever seen. And it was no easy task choosing a winner. Madison's breath caught. Her chest felt tight as she waited, her heart pounding in her ears. The winner of this year's contest is... Mr. Whitaker paused, glancing at the envelope in his hand. Madison Evans, for her essay, Finding My Voice. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Madison stared in disbelief as the auditorium erupted into applause. Sophie grabbed her arm, shaking her excitedly. You did it, Maddie. Madison stood slowly, her legs shaky as she made her way to the stage. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. But for the first time, it didn't scare her. She climbed the steps and took the paper certificate Mr. Whitaker handed her. then stepped up to the microphone. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, it grew steadier. Writing this essay taught me something important. She began. It taught me that people will always have their opinions about you, about who you are, what you deserve, and where you belong, but their opinions don't define you. What matters is that you stay true to yourself and keep showing up, no matter how hard it gets. As she spoke, her eyes drifted over the crowd, landing briefly on Jason. For once, he wasn't smirking. His expression was blank, caught somewhere between surprise and embarrassment. Madison smiled faintly. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need Mrs. Trenton's approval either. She had found something far more important, her voice. The applause that followed wasn't just for the essay. It was for the girl who had learned to stand tall in the face of doubt. That afternoon, as Madison walked through the hallways, students approached her with smiles and congratulations. Even those who had whispered behind her back seemed to see her differently now. "Your essay was amazing," one girl said shyly. "It really made me think." Madison thanked her, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. When she finally reached Sophie at their lunch table, her friend grinned. "You showed them, Maddie." Madison smiled back, her chest swelling with pride. "I guess I did." And as the afternoon sun filtered through the cafeteria windows, she realized that for the first time since starting at North Ridge Academy, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen. She felt strong. She felt like herself. And that was enough. The days that followed the assembly were different, lighter somehow. The hallways that had once felt so suffocating no longer loomed over Madison like dark clouds. People who had never spoken to her before offered shy smiles or words of encouragement, their whispers replaced by respect. Jason, who had made it his mission to humiliate her, now avoided her gaze. Madison couldn't deny the satisfaction it brought. But she knew deep down that this wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about proving something to herself, that she was stronger than she ever thought possible. At lunch, Madison and Sophie sat in their usual spot. But this time, their table wasn't so empty. A few students stopped by to say hello or ask about her essay. And Harper, the quiet, bookish girl from history class, joined them with a tray in hand. "That was really brave, what you said during the assembly," Harper said, her voice soft but sincere. I related to it a lot." Madison's smile widened. "Thank you. I'm glad it meant something." Sophie grinned, throwing an arm around Madison's shoulders. "You're basically a celebrity now." Madison laughed. "I don't know about that." "Seriously," Harper added, her voice gaining confidence. "You gave people like me hope. I've always felt invisible too, like no one really sees me. But your essay, it made me feel like I'm not alone." Madison's heart swelled. For so long, she had felt like her words didn't matter. But now she realized how powerful they could be. She wasn't alone, and neither were the people around her. They just needed someone to stand up and say it out loud. Later that afternoon, Madison gathered her books after literature class, her heart thudding softly as she approached Mrs. Trenton's desk. The teacher looked up from her stack of papers, her expression as unreadable as ever. "Yes, Madison?" Madison hesitated for a brief moment before speaking. I wanted to say thank you." Mrs. Trenton raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For pushing me," Madison said, her voice steady. "Your critiques made me stronger, even if I didn't realize it at first." For a second, something flickered in Mrs. Trenton's gaze, surprise, maybe, or approval, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "Growth comes from discomfort, Madison. I'm glad you understand that." "I do," Madison replied, "but I also learned that I don't have to live up to anyone else's idea of who I should be." Mrs. Trenton stared at her, her sharp expression softening just slightly. "Then perhaps I've taught you something after all." Madison nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. It wasn't exactly an apology, but she realized she didn't need one. Mrs. Trenton was who she was, and Madison was learning to stand firm in her own truth. That was enough. As the weeks passed, Madison and Sophie began working with Harper on a new project, creating a student support group. Inspired by Madison's essay, the group would be a safe space where students could share their experiences and lift each other up. They called it, Voices Matter. "We want people to know they're not alone," Harper explained at the first meeting, her voice shaking a little but growing steadier with each word. "Everyone deserves to feel seen and heard." The turnout at the first meeting was small, just a handful of students, but their stories were powerful. A quiet boy admitted he had felt invisible since middle school. Another girl shared how she struggled to keep up in class because of anxiety. Madison listened, her heart full. For the first time, she realized just how many people were carrying invisible burdens, just like she had been. As more students joined over the following weeks, Voices Matter gained momentum. Madison felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a community where no one had to feel alone. One crisp Saturday morning, Madison and her mother sat together on the porch, sipping hot chocolate and watching the sun rise over the neighborhood. The air was cool and smelled faintly of autumn leaves. "You've changed," Caroline said suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. Madison glanced over, surprised. "What do you mean?" Caroline smiled warmly, setting her mug down. "You seem more confident, like you found your place." Madison thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "I think I have. I spent so much time trying to hide from who I was, but now I'm okay with it. I'm okay with being me." Caroline reached over and squeezed her hand. "I'm so proud of you, Maddie." Madison's chest swelled with warmth. She had spent months feeling like she didn't belong, like her voice didn't matter. But now, she saw how much she had grown. She wasn't just Caroline Evans' daughter, or the new girl at North Ridge Academy. She was Madison, a writer, a leader, and someone who wasn't afraid to stand up for herself and others. The following Monday, as Madison walked through the hallways of North Ridge Academy, she caught sight of Jason leaning against his locker. He glanced up as she passed, his expression unsure, as though he wanted to say something but didn't know how. For the first time, Madison didn't feel intimidated. She offered him a small nod and kept walking. Jason didn't define her, and neither did his words. As she rounded the corner, she spotted Sophie and Harper waiting for her outside their next class. Sophie waved, grinning brightly. "Hey, superstar. Not this again." Madison groaned playfully, rolling her eyes. Harper smiled softly. "You did change things. You know, for me, for all of us." Madison felt a swell of pride. "We all did," she replied, her voice steady. The bell rang, and the three of them headed into the classroom together, their laughter echoing down the hall. As Madison sat in her seat and pulled out her notebook, she smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. 1 year later, North Ridge Academy felt like a completely different place. The Voices Matter group had grown into a thriving community, with regular meetings and new students joining every month. Madison, Sophie, and Harper had become leaders of the group, helping others share their stories and find their voices. On a bright spring afternoon, Madison stood on stage at the school's annual assembly, the same spot where she had once shared her essay. This time, she wasn't nervous. She held the microphone with confidence as she addressed the packed auditorium. "Every voice matters," Madison said, looking out at the sea of students. "We all have something important to say, even if it takes us time to find the courage to say it. The hardest part is believing that our stories are worth sharing, but they are. You are." The applause that followed wasn't for just her. It was for everyone who had ever felt invisible and found the strength to stand tall. As Madison stepped off the stage, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. She had come so far from the girl who walked into North Ridge Academy feeling lost and unsure. She had found her voice, and, along the way, she had helped others find theirs too. And she knew this was just the beginning of her story. As the new school year unfolded, Madison and her friends poured their energy into growing Voices Matter. What had once been a small gathering of hesitant students had now transformed into a movement. Posters decorated the hallways, inviting anyone to join, and even teachers had started acknowledging the group's impact. One Friday afternoon, as Madison and Harper prepared for the meeting, they noticed something surprising. A familiar figure standing just outside the library doors. Jason. Madison froze, her heart skipping a beat. For months, Jason had left her alone, and she had moved on. But now, seeing him hovering awkwardly by the door, a mix of curiosity and nervousness on his face, caught her off guard. "What do you think he wants?" Harper whispered, clutching a stack of flyers. Madison took a deep breath. "Let's find out." She walked over, her steps steady, meeting Jason's uncertain gaze. "Hey," she said, her voice calm. "Are you here for the meeting?" Jason scratched the back of his neck, looking anywhere but at her. Yeah, I thought I'd check it out. Harper glanced at Madison, unsure, but Madison simply smiled faintly. Well, come on in. Jason hesitated for a moment before following them into the library. The room was buzzing with quiet conversation as students settled into chairs and small groups. Madison introduced Jason to Sophie, who raised an eyebrow but kept her thoughts to herself. As the meeting began, Madison stood at the front of the room, a sense of pride filling her chest. Welcome back, everyone. Today's meeting is about sharing the things we wish others understood about us. Sometimes people make assumptions about who we are, and it's easy to feel invisible or misunderstood. This is a space where you can talk about it, where you'll be heard. For the first time, Jason didn't look smug or indifferent. He looked thoughtful. At the end of the meeting, Madison noticed Jason lingering by the table where snacks and flyers were laid out. She approached him carefully, unsure of what to expect. Did you find it helpful? She asked softly. Jason shrugged, his usual bravado nowhere to be found. I don't know. I guess I didn't think something like this mattered. But it's kinda nice, hearing other people talk about stuff. Madison studied him for a moment. Everyone's going through something, Jason. Sometimes people tear others down because it's easier than dealing with their own stuff. Jason flinched slightly but nodded. Yeah, I get that now. There was an honesty in his voice that surprised her. Jason shoved his hands in his pockets, avoiding her gaze. I'm sorry. For everything. I was a jerk to you. Madison blinked, caught off guard by the apology. Thank you, she said after a moment. It doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Jason looked at her, his expression sincere. I mean it. I guess I just didn't like seeing someone being stronger than me. You know? Madison smiled faintly. Being strong doesn't mean you can't ask for help. Jason nodded, processing her words. Yeah, maybe I needed to hear that. As Jason left the room, Harper and Sophie approached, both watching him go. Did that actually just happen? Sophie asked, wide-eyed. Madison smiled. People can change. Sometimes they just need someone to believe they can. Winter arrived, bringing with it a new energy to Northridge Academy. Students seemed more connected, their walls beginning to lower as Voices Matter continued to thrive. Teachers, once skeptical, now praised the group for its positive impact. Madison found herself busier than ever, balancing her leadership role in the group with schoolwork and her growing love for writing. She had started keeping a journal, jotting down her thoughts, dreams, and stories. Writing had become her way of processing the world around her, a place where she could be completely honest. One day, as she sat alone in the library, Mrs. Trenton approached her table. Madison looked up, surprised. Madison, Mrs. Trenton said, her voice quieter than usual. May I sit? Madison nodded, unsure of where this was going. Mrs. Trenton lowered herself into the chair across from her, placing a hand on the stack of books she carried. I read your essay again recently. Mrs. Trenton began, her tone softer. It was powerful, more than I gave it credit for. Madison blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected compliment. Mrs. Trenton sighed, her usual stern expression giving way to something more reflective. Sometimes we teachers forget that we have as much to learn as our students do. I may have been too hard on you, Madison, perhaps because I saw something in you that I couldn't name at the time, potential. Madison swallowed the lump in her throat. Thank you, she said quietly. Mrs. Trenton offered a small, rare smile. Keep writing. Your voice matters. As Mrs. Trenton walked away, Madison stared down at her notebook, her heart full. The woman who had once been her harshest critic was now encouraging her to keep going. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. By spring, Madison's life at Northridge Academy felt completely different. She no longer dreaded walking through the school doors or hearing whispers in the halls. She felt seen, not because of her last name, but because of who she had become. The Voices Matter group had become a fixture at the school, its influence spreading beyond the library walls. Students supported each other in ways they hadn't before, and the culture of the school had started to shift. On a sunny afternoon, Madison sat with Sophie and Harper under a tree in the school courtyard, their laughter drifting through the warm air. Jason passed by, giving them a small wave before joining some of his friends at another table. Who would have thought we'd be here? Sophie said, grinning. Madison smiled, looking around. It's funny, isn't it? How much can change in a year? Harper nodded thoughtfully. It's because you spoke up. Madison, you showed us that our voices matter. Too. Madison felt a swell of pride. We did it together. The bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, and the three friends stood, gathering their things. As Madison walked back into the school, she paused for a moment to take it all in, the sound of footsteps, the chatter of students, the hum of a school that finally felt like home. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was Madison Evans, a writer, a leader, and a girl who had found her voice. And as she stepped into her next class, notebook in hand and head held high, she knew this was only the beginning of her story. 2 years later, Madison sat in her room, a stack of freshly printed pages in front of her. The title of her new manuscript read, Voices Matter. Stories of Finding Strength. She had turned her experiences, and those of her friends, into a book. One that she hoped would help others feel seen and understood. Across the room, her mother stood beaming, holding a mug of tea. I'm so proud of you, Caroline said, her voice full of emotion. Madison smiled. I wouldn't be here without you. As she flipped through the pages, Madison felt a deep sense of peace. Her story wasn't perfect, and her journey hadn't been easy. But every challenge had brought her to this moment. Madison glanced out the window, sunlight streaming through the glass, and smiled. The girl who once felt invisible had become someone who could help others find their voices, too. And she knew, without a doubt, that her story was far from over. Months later, Madison stood backstage at a small auditorium, her manuscript clutched in her hands. The crowd outside murmured softly, filling the room with an undercurrent of excitement. Madison's book, Voices Matter. Stories of Finding Strength, had been published and received with overwhelming support, something she hadn't dared to dream when she first started writing. Now, she was about to give a reading at her school, the very place where her journey began. The event was a mix of current students, teachers, and members of the community, all gathered to celebrate the stories that had emerged from her group. Madison took a deep breath, steadying herself as Sophie approached with a reassuring grin. You're gonna knock their socks off, she said, giving Madison a nudge. Harper was there too, holding her own copy of the book. We're so proud of you, Maddie, she added softly. You've done something amazing. Madison smiled, their support bolstering her confidence. Thanks, you guys. I couldn't have done it without you. The stage manager gave her a signal, and Madison stepped into the spotlight, the murmurs quieting as she reached the podium. For a moment, the bright stage lights blinded her, but then she focused on the faces in the audience. Her mother sat in the front row, beaming with pride, and even Mrs. Trenton was there, her expression unreadable but softer than before. Madison began to read from her book, her voice steady and full of conviction. The passage was about the first Voices Matter meeting, how she had started with nothing but a need to speak up and a hope that others might listen. And for so long, I thought my voice didn't matter, that I was too small, too unimportant to make a difference. But I learned that when we share our stories, we change the world, maybe not all at once, but one person, one heart at a time. The crowd erupted into applause when she finished, the sound washing over her like a wave. Madison felt tears prick the corners of her eyes as she stepped back from the podium. For so long, she had doubted herself, but this moment was proof that she had been right to believe in her voice. After the event, students and teachers approached Madison, offering congratulations and praise. She felt humbled by how many people had been touched by her words. Standing near the edge of the room, Madison noticed Mrs. Trenton walking toward her. Madison straightened instinctively, unsure of what to expect. When Mrs. Trenton finally spoke, her voice was calm but genuine. That was impressive, Madison, she said, offering a faint smile. You've come a long way. Madison smiled back. Thank you. That means a lot. Mrs. Trenton paused, as if choosing her words carefully. I was hard on you. Maybe too hard. I've spent a lot of time reflecting on that. I hope you know, my intent was never to tear you down, only to push you. I understand now, Madison replied, her voice kind, but I also learned that I needed to believe in myself first. Mrs. Trenton's eyes softened. And you should. Keep writing, Madison. The world needs voices like yours. Madison felt a surge of gratitude as Mrs. Trenton walked away. In that moment, she realized how far they both had come, each of them learning in their own way. As the school year continued, the Voices Matter group expanded into something even bigger. Inspired by Madison's book and the program's success, schools in neighboring districts started creating their own versions of the group. Madison, Sophie, and Harper traveled to other schools to share their experiences, helping students start their own support spaces. At each stop, Madison heard stories that were both unique and familiar, students who felt unheard, teachers looking for ways to better support their classrooms, and communities coming together to lift each other up. On one particularly sunny afternoon, Madison and Harper stood in front of a group of middle school students. Madison watched as a shy girl hesitated before raising her hand. "How do you know what to say when you're scared no one will listen?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. Madison smiled warmly. "You don't always know," she admitted, "but you say it anyway. Because your voice matters. Even if it shakes, there will always be someone who hears you." The girl nodded, her eyes lighting up with hope. As Madison looked around the room, she saw so many faces just like hers when she first started, unsure, afraid, but searching for courage. Years passed, and Madison's journey continued to unfold. By the time she was in college, her name was starting to gain recognition beyond her hometown. She wrote essays, gave talks, and continued to advocate for mental health and self-expression in schools. Her mother, Caroline, remained her greatest supporter, always reminding Madison to stay true to herself. "No matter how far you go," Caroline told her one day, "never forget where you started." And Madison never did. Each time she stood in front of an audience, she thought back to the first time she spoke up, to the fear, the doubt, and the realization that her words carried power. Years later, Madison returned to North Ridge Academy as a guest speaker for a special assembly. The familiar auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and parents, all waiting to hear from her. Madison stood on stage, her heart swelling with emotion as she looked out at the crowd. Her mother sat in the front row again, her eyes filled with pride. Sophie and Harper were there too, now teachers at local schools, continuing the work they had started together. Many years ago, Madison began, "I sat where you're sitting, feeling like my voice didn't matter. I thought I was invisible, just another face in the crowd. But I was wrong. Every one of you has a voice, a story worth telling, and when you share it, you inspire others to do the same." The room fell silent as Madison's words sank in, the weight of her message palpable. Voices Matter started as a small idea, but it became a movement because we believed in it. We believed in ourselves. And now it's your turn to believe, too. As the crowd erupted into applause, Madison stepped back, a smile tugging at her lips. She had come full circle, from the girl who felt invisible to the woman standing proudly on this stage. And as she looked out at the sea of faces, she knew one thing for certain. Her journey was just beginning.